thanks to all the speakers, some really thought-provoking and I think important things to think about. I'm going to talk to the last presentation. I agree wholeheartedly with everything that you kind of raised, including the kind of personal opinions that were there. I'm fully on board with those. I want to probably share too much of a personal anecdote and just add one thing into that. So I found myself in late 2021 suddenly on the dating scene again. And there was nothing quite like being online dating in West Virginia as the head of the data for COVID-19 for the state to discover the gap between scientists and the general population in what we understood science to be, what we understood our roles to be. So I think the message you gave about getting out of your bubble and speaking to people about what we do is really important. That lack of messaging had been building for many years, maybe decades, that became apparent at that time. So the thing I want to add is, as well as speaking, listen, because the public have concerns about science, how it's conducted, and it's really important to take those on board and be mindful about how we address this, what science we're doing, and really question, are we doing things that are benefiting humankind? It's very easy to get caught in our bubbles, to pursue publications, to pursue grant funding as the means, as the end, rather than the means to the end. So do get out of your bubbles, speak to people, but also listen carefully, because they do have valid concerns.
Thanks for sharing that with us. One thing I would just add to the notion of yes, I agree completely about listening. One thing I would say about talking to different groups of stakeholders, it can be enormous amounts of fun. You actually learn things about your own research by virtue of those discussions. I think that's in part what you're alluding to. And it makes you think differently about some of the things you should be doing, which to me is very important.
I like that answer a lot, thank you. Hi, I'm Monica Munoz from School of Medicine at the University of Colorado and one of the standard lead for the Bridge to AI project. So I have a question for Dr. Berger. Thank you so much for sharing the insight on Gray. And given what you were, just wanted to say that I am super ignited and excited to get connected with some of the other things that you said as the S-index and the other points. I have a question. I would like maybe to better understand how Gray and something like the Common Fund data ecosystem, which I think have very much things in overlapping in common, how are they connected? I really like how you share things about Gray, and I wonder what are some efforts within NIH for the interoperability of the two and the the sustainability for the two. Thank you.
Thanks. So first of all, thank you for your work on Bridge to AI. Super exciting program. For those who don't know Bridge to AI, it's our program to develop AI-ready, high-quality flagship data sets in very specific domains. So which Bridge program are you on?
Bridge Center.
Bridge Center. Oh, you're the center. Okay, that's the hub, the hub of all of the Bridge to AI. So it's a really interesting thought, the Gray Initiative cooperation between Generalist repositories and the Common Fund data ecosystem, which is knitting together data resources from each of the Common Fund programs like HubMap and Spark, which have completely different data and sometimes very inharmonious data. So one of the recommendations that we got from a panel of experts on the Gray Initiative that went to the Council of Councils was to actually start working with initiatives like domain-specific repositories to start bridging those gaps. So although we don't work with the Common Fund data ecosystem, I could see that as part of the future, and even our leadership is telling us we have to bring these models of cooperation to other data initiatives like real-world data. So I see this as a future effort, but not as a thing that we've done yet so far today. So that's great. One point on the comment about working and talking with communities, one of the programs I run is called Aim Ahead, and it's a program to bring artificial intelligence to communities that are absolutely not doing it at all, like HBCUs, or have a spark of a potential. And part of the remit is to work in underserved communities to actually listen to what it is that they're concerned about. Is it diabetes or is it hypertension? And work with them to develop maybe decision support tools or maybe chatbots in other languages. And that listening and working with those communities in a scientific way has been revolutionizing the way we're thinking about our programs in AI. And I would encourage you, when you're thinking about starting a program, maybe do more work with the community to hear what, where is their scientific interest, and bringing them along with you rather than after the fact. It's just an amazing opportunity to help lift many boats, and it will improve your science in ways you never would expect.
Sorry, hi, I'm a nervous PhD student, and also I think unlike most people here, English is not my mother tongue, so please excuse any problems I might have articulating myself. So I wanted to basically ask about what to me seems kind of maybe more of an mission than actual subject matter, but you mentioned that there was a massive expansion in the number of data resources recently, and I would first be very interested in whether or not you could comment on anything concerning the geographical distribution of these. And with respect to that, most of the agencies, and especially political bodies you highlighted as potential targets for advocacy, like something, well, they also cluster very obviously geographically, right? And I just figure, this is obviously future facing, but have you thought about how this might play out with respect to other parts of the world stepping up into the space, right, and being responsible for stewardship of these resources? Does that make sense to you? No.
That's a question. Yeah, thanks for that. No, it makes sense. So we're subject to observation bias, and so the way our primary method for discovering that long tail, and there are other initiatives to do this in a different way, but our method was to say, well, if you are a data resource and you want people to come and use your data resource, you will publish a paper that describes your data resource. And so we have a method that identifies papers that don't just mention, but it tunes the selection to those data resources, those papers that are describing your data resource. But in the world of molecular biology, it's very common, if you have a database you want to open with, it's very common to write a paper down. So you put it in MAR or mathematics, and that's just a normal thing to do. But that doesn't mean it's a normal thing to do in the biodiversity ecology world or the taxonomy world. And so the way we're finding data resources is a bit selective. So perhaps it's not surprising that we find them in a biased distribution around the world. So we don't know why there's been a growth. But part of it is in this definition of database, and it's likely, I think, that we're including. So often, if you're running a research project, you will need to do something with your data that's more than that requires a database. And sometimes you will publish that, but you have no intention of running that database for a long time. It may be transiently important and maybe part of the infrastructure that people are using, but it's not necessarily expected to last a long time. And so our method doesn't discriminate between those. So that's something we have to do more work on. One thing we haven't got a well. So this goes back to the first comment actually about talking to the public and talking to other stakeholders. One of the big groups of stakeholders that we actually don't have necessarily a good handle on is the users, the user community, because the infrastructure has the data resources that we use most are those that have come up with interfaces that at least for the limited for the many transactions, they are very intuitive, and you can go in, you dial up your gene or you dial up your structure and you take it away. You don't dwell for very long, and you get what you need. So it's a tendency is often to think, well, it was simple to do what I needed to do, and you don't think about what's behind it. So actually, a lot of the direct user community of data resources is not fully au fait with they understand their databases, which ones they go to and how to use them, but they're not aware of the kind of systems that exist to support them and the kind of fragility that there is there as well. So we have a job of work to communicate with the users, and that includes addressing some of these biases. So because of the databases we know about and because of the backgrounds of the people involved in GBC and the funders involved in GBC, we tend to focus towards the molecular biology end of things. So that's one comment. But essentially, we're analysing. We compare our discovered data resources to those in from say fair sharing or I forget the name of the database commons, yeah, and the NER online collection, and we see a good intersect, and that's great. But it's the things that are not in the intersect that are interesting. So we're developing a better understanding of what we know about, and then using that to try to branch out into other areas. And so we have so some of the global core biodata resources, for example, have a very different network of users that's overlapping, but they have a bigger section of users who don't tend to use the other data resources. So that's a good source of people from a slightly, to sort of remove some of the biases. So one thing is, that's the first part of that is about describing where the infrastructure is at the moment, and we're biased a little bit in the way we do that. The next thing is about thinking about where the infrastructure should be, because as I tried to argue, I think that's an important part of building a joined up integrated system of the highest possible values. You have to encourage things to happen where it's sensible for them to happen, and not just where they might be happening at the moment. But again, we have a map, but we don't have all of the points in it, so we don't quite know where things should be. And of course, it's not for an organisation like GBC to say where things should happen. It's for us to enable them to happen if it's appropriate for them to happen.
Thank you. So I'm glad that you mentioned biodiversity, because my question was related to this. So when you speak about NIH, it makes a dependency on the United States, but also a dependency on biomedical motivation for funding our resources. And how much do we lose in sustainability by having this very strong emphasis in the end? We're often justified by the biomedical applications. So firstly, this excludes completely some resources, like the Arabidopsis information resource is not funded. But also it means that in times of budget crunch, we're going to recenter on the really strictly medical ones. And a lot of things got funded in a time of high budgets, so being slightly related to biomedical will no longer get funded. So how can we get away from this focus? I think we have an over-focus on biomedical funding for our resources, even whereas life science are much broader than just biomedical research.
This actually, if I may, makes me think about a thought experiment I would encourage you all to do, which is we have a completely clean sheet. We don't have any of the data resources we have today. We don't have any of the economic models. We don't have any of the global distribution issues that we have that we've heard about today. Think about starting something from scratch, and think about, just as a mind game, what that would look like, and then try and do something to actually help the community move towards what it is you're envisioning. Because the point you made about ecological and other kinds of data resources, I think the real power, and being in a school of data science, I see this all the time, is bringing these things together across many different domains and disciplines, which are all funded in very different and sometimes arcane ways. And yet the science itself is going to advance by virtue of being able to overcome these discrepancies and put the data together in all the ways that we talk around the fair and everything else. And that's the real power of what the science can do and what we're actually shooting for. And in some ways, the way we have things set up right now are just making that exceedingly difficult and unsustainable.
Maybe if I can just add to this, I'm a little bit more also, to echo this also, I'm a bit more optimistic. I see also a lot of
the Prince of Lightness.
a lot of convergence also across different domains. We heard about the pathogens, for instance, and I think COVID was really interesting there in that, there's a realization of what is also happening in nature is also highly relevant. And we see this, the sequences that are useful, from microbiome data may be useful actually to model structures that are relevant for drug development. And so it's a lot of technique that we are using actually going across domains. So I think this is also reflected in meetings such as this one where we have maybe different causes, but then there's more and more needs to have also joint causes sessions. This was the case, for instance, between functional evolution. So I think, I mean, there's also reason to be optimistic, but it will be interesting perhaps to have a view also from NIH on this.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I resonate a lot with what Phil was saying, that I think, biomedical research, while it used to focus on just a narrow slice of science, I think as I've seen just very recently, it's going to be much more broader and much more encompassing of a lot of different ideas. And so as you were thinking about ecological data resources, I like what Phil was thinking in terms of think broadly about how you want to match your mission with other types of funding opportunities. In fact, even a partnership with, for example, plant science and plant organizations could be of interest. So I would broaden the way that you think about getting funding and the work that you're doing. NIH will always be interested if you have an application of one of many, and one of them is biomedical, we'll certainly be interested in that. But it behooves you to think much more broadly, and even those public-private partnerships could be a benefit.
Hi, it's Tony Burnett, I'm the Director of Biofair. I think in your presentations, you all touched on the importance of looking at the impacts of data resources, and also mostly all pointed at the fact that many data resources exist in a network or a wider ecosystem and connect to each other. And Guy especially talked about the difficulties of being open and sustainable. And this all makes me think about the importance of data journeys rather than individual data resources. And it puts me in mind a little bit of if I draw from the internet, there was once upon a time people used to look at their page views and count how many page views they got. Then sort of the world moved and everyone used Google Analytics or something to instrument where people came from, how people navigated their website, what they did afterwards. So my question is, what's the equivalent of Google Analytics for data journeys in the data resource landscape?
I think it's a Guy question.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I think it's sort of largely not there, because the system doesn't need to understand how it's working to work. That's the way it's grown up. So the challenge the GBC has in arguing, saying to funders, this is really important, you need to look after it, it's at risk, and you've got this opportunity. The challenge we have is explaining what it is, and we don't know what it is because we don't know all of the moving parts. And so if we want to think about it as a data journey rather than individual resources, so the stopping points for the data, say, then we have to investigate it to describe it that way. But I think what I think it's just to pick on a thing that you're getting at as well, is that we think about data resources. I describe this as a set of data resources that are distinct, but they live within the ecosystem, so they communicate with each other. And if you did that blank sheet and designed the whole thing again, I don't think we think about it that way. It's just a feature of the history. It's a feature of the way people champion particular platforms and particular data types. The history of the way there's been a lot of project-based funding, and the way people have to justify their work is that you end up with these branded, quite monolithic resources that then have to learn how to communicate with each other. And actually, what the scientific community needs is a set of functions. You need to be able to go and get the structure here, you need to analyze this there and search for that. You don't need to have a set of distinct things that are operating in an ecosystem. But that's where we are. And so the question is often, how do I understand that in different ways? But I think you raised an important point that it isn't. There is probably no one data resource that will necessarily be sustained for another 100 years. I mean, some of them will be going for 50 years. Maybe they will, but maybe not. But certainly some of the functions they provide need to be sustained in some way.
I have another thought too, and this is and plus idea. I love the idea about the graphs and the numbers and the papers that are getting cited by resources, but when I talk to Congress, I tell them one story about one impact from one repository and why it's important. And I always have that story, and I have probably one for each of your resources, because what people remember, especially Congress people, is the story, and they will take that back with them, especially if it's from their district. So give me a story. That's what the impact is for me.
particularly a human story.
Yep, absolutely.
I mean, going back to that blank sheet of paper and thinking about the incentives you would put into a system, it would be completely different. You wouldn't have something like, I like the idea of the S index. I think that to me would be something I would roll into I would write on my blank sheet. What I wouldn't write on my blank sheet, oh, here's a reference to the PDB, it has 40,000 citations. No one's ever read that paper. There's absolutely no reason to read that paper. The only reason it's there is to reference a set of data. Let's figure out a better way. We're now using DOIs and all sorts of other mechanisms. Let's elevate the value of how we perceive that referenceable object of data. It starts for me in terms of what we are actually teaching our students and getting them to think, and then of course with our respective faculties of how we start thinking about reward systems, tenure and so forth, and promotion, that really roll these things into that landscape. As an example, we have a promotion and tenure policy that doesn't look like most others. We actually try and measure the degree of openness that our faculty have actually put into their work and actually use that as a promotion criteria. So these are just examples of things that could go onto that white sheet, which relates to the incentives, which is, I think, absolutely critical on all of this.
Hi, I'm Julio Collado from Mexico. And, I'm now inspired by this recording where we are with John Lennon's place of I Have a Dream. Everybody. So, I met once Harris Lewin, the director of this project of the global, the planet biogenome project of sequencing, all life, right? And he, together with Alfredo, made me aware that in the Latin American region, it covers I think a huge amount of the biodiversity. So the contrast was in the picture of Harris showing us how, the awareness and the project and the technology comes, of course, from the north, from Europe, from US, and nonetheless, largest fraction of biodiversity is in other regions. And so we are here hearing about US projects of the biological infrastructure and European elixir. And I wish one day you can think of, forgetting about nations. Biology is one single thing, the whole planet, and humanity right now is in the same way. There is still this notion of humanity, or however you want to call our current situation. Because we have a lot of wonderful things in places like, I can talk about Mexico. We made another program a while ago with students that are very successful going abroad. I just went to give a talk at EBI, and it was a surprise to me to see 4 students coming from Cuernavaca, Mexico, that are doing PhD or postdoc or whatever. And I know that there are many of them in the many best places in the world. So those, Mexico is still much better than if you go to Central America or other more, countries with less tradition in science. And nonetheless, I still believe, of course, that science, not only because of the results, but because of the teaching of the scientific attitude towards nature and ourselves, is the future, if any, humanity. So hopefully one day you can, within your areas of influence and push for, I know this is not the best moment, but one day you can think of, all these resources to be open for application from anywhere in the world where we can come up and jointly first or whatever, just on the standards of quality of research or impact in the science and in the people of the work we do.
Thank you very much for this point. I think data is indeed particularly suited to foster collaboration at the global level. Some other things are much more tricky actually to transfer, and there's some other constraints. And so I think I was really encouraged by like the efforts in Africa now around the African Bioinformatics Institute, which is taking shape with a lot of enthusiasm. And this is also an area where there's a lot of biodiversity. I know some resources, they have curation teams in Brazil because you can have excellent science there, but also you can do quite a bit more work for the same amount of money and go a longer way for resources that then are of global interest. And so, of course, one concern we can have, and I'll say this on my personal capacity, is of course, as you know, countries are looking a little bit more inwards as opposed to working collaboratively. This can add a lot of constraint in, like, for instance, this international consortia. But I think we have to find some other ways, some ways that will be compliant, but that are maybe using different mechanism, and that exploit the notion that the data can be duplicated and shared across borders. I mean, even actually, it's very encouraging, for instance, that there's so much data that is flowing to China and back, despite all the firewalls that you would have like in some other areas. Just to give one example, and I think this is an area really where worldwide collaboration is uniquely suited.
I want to acknowledge and thank you. NIH has supported my research for 20 years from direct NIH application, because it used to be an international, one of the few places where you could apply from international support. So I hope that
Yeah, I think we'll see some opening as things become in place and we get the mechanisms down for international collaboration. It's a bit of a hiccup right now.
Sorry, it's me again. Just as a brief callback to your 0-day scenario, what if we had to build it all up again, maybe in that vein? As much as it pains me, coming originally by my studies from computer science, it seems that today the biggest strides people have made in terms of distributed infrastructure are within the, movie distributing industries, I would say, particular kinds especially. And maybe if you actually were to reconstruct all that infrastructure, this level of distribution would certainly be something that technically these days is much more feasible than in the early days of the human genome project, right? So as much as it may not right now be the historical moment, but certainly there will be a time to relinquish that geographic control of stewardship. So I was very much in tune with that notion.
So hi, I'm Carol Goldwood, one of the chairs of the conference. If you had 2 sentences to offer to brief a science Sherpa for the ministers meeting in G7, what would it be? I'm asking for a friend.
About data resources?
Anything. You have an opportunity. If you speak it will go directly into my notebook.
If it were me, I would tell the AlphaFold story. I would, because the impact of that, looking at the CAS and the evolution of CAS and structure prediction, and all the hard work that crystallographers have done over the years, and all the hard work that all folks like David Baker and others have done, and then to watch the evolution of AI and relying on building on all of those many pieces to just make prediction of protein structure something my son, who is not in any way in this field, can do because it's basically on the computer. It's opened up education and understanding of proteins in ways that I think make it more accessible to the average everyday person. And that is pretty exciting because it gets people interested in science. So that if I were me, I would probably tell that story because it brings together data resources, training, experimentalists, and new people, new generations of young people.
Anyone else?
Yeah, so I would go for something that's a little bit, so I don't want to put down, this AlphaFold is remarkable. I don't want to put it down, but I would go for something that's a bit more mature. So AlphaFold is doing great things for science, so it's bringing people into science, as we heard, that weren't connected otherwise. It's helping the scientific method, but I haven't, I mean, they will come, but I don't know how many absolute benefits have arisen, advances have been made based on AlphaFold that have actually impacted society yet. I know it can do lots of things, and it will do. So perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps there are things I don't know about yet.
The suspense is unbearable.
So I would go for something like childhood cancer, childhood leukemia, where the 5-year survival rate has gone from, it depends where you are in the world, but it's gone from something like 25% up to something like 85, 90%. And that's so much better. I mean, it's based on lots of things beyond data, but data is absolutely central to that. So I would go for an example like that, where something's really had a chance to give something to society that's compelling.
That's beginning to get out of the bubble, but it's still in the bubble. So I would say, our society is facing an existential threat in many different ways. And science and technology are really the foundation for getting out of that situation for everyone on the planet. It doesn't matter which member of the G7 you are, it's affecting you. And it's only going to come by putting more resources into the support of science and technology.
So the follow-on to that story, there's a company that has evolved because of AlphaFold to basically soup to nuts predict what would be a nice target for a particular disease. In this case, it's I think it's ischemic pancreatic disease. I'm not super good at the medical part, but from start to finish, they were able to identify a number of targets using an algorithm similar to AlphaFold, go from phase 1 to phase 3 clinical trials in America and China in 18 months. That is typically at least a 10-year process. That return on investment, because of the initial work of AlphaFold, is huge. And that's a company that is international. And I'll get the name of the company, it's not at the top of my head.
Another global thought, I would tell a G7 member, I met an alien who just came from outer space. The very first thing they said to me is there's no intelligent life down here. Because the way we do things needs to change. And they need to change so we're working much more cooperatively together rather than in opposition. And
I'll try that, Phil. At the moment, it's the words data sovereignty and national assets seem to be the words du jour. So, okay, thanks for the inspiring words.
Maybe just like I just rejoined it. How about something like COVID-19, lest we forget, or pathogen X, lest we forget? I mean, I find it really like amazing how fast people seem to have forgotten. But I mean, that existential threat, I mean, that's pathogen X. I think it should be like one of the great motivators still. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I think that my question or comments is towards the Prince of Darkness. I really like your presentation, and especially at the beginning when you cite Charles Darwin's quote in the tale of two cities. In your presentation, that you alluded to that it's a time for change, and it's time for us to think about the new models to fund the data sources. I was wondering whether you have, and you can elaborate additional thoughts about where and how we find the new models or new funding sources for.
Guy knows about this because we talk about it all the time, but, you know, to be honest, you know, fortunately, at my age, it doesn't matter if I lose friends, you know, but it's so much of what I hear, even today to some extent, are things we've been saying for a long, long time. And I just happened to be saying that after one meeting to someone, this is the joys of working in a very multidisciplinary environment, with a young faculty member of my school, Terry Johnson, who's an economist. And we started talking about models for how to create a sustainable data system. And the fact is that an economist has a completely different view. This is part of getting out of the bubble for a different reason. It's really to get intellect from a whole different set of folks. Folks also, for example, doing study of the science of science have a lot to say about this kind of thing, particularly as it relates to incentive schemes and so on. So we actually came up with a model, and interestingly, no one in this room, I don't think, at any juncture would have actually thought this model 2 years ago, which is when we first put it together, would actually be in any way viable. I'm not for a moment saying it is viable now, but I think it's potentially, or something like it, is more viable than it would have been back than it ever was, because we're in a moment in my 45, 50 years of science, we've never been in a moment like this. And so I think, you know, it is a time to be thinking differently. There's a paper in Archive by Johnson and Bourne, you can go and dig it up and just get a sense. We're actually trying to encode this model and actually test it out. And again, I don't think it's the right model. It's partly why we're having this workshop, is to get a lot of different viewpoints on how we might approach this in a different way. And, you know, people outside of our bubble think about this really differently. Just one final thought on that. A number of years ago, I had Susan does such a much better job than I did when I was in that same role, but we had a workshop with a whole group of folks, particularly from the gig economy, around data sustainability and preservation. And I asked that the chief data officers of various states, including the chief data officer of, I think it was Airbnb, I said to him, how do you decide what data to throw away? And he said, throw away? What do you mean throw away? We figure out how to monetize it. And ultimately, particularly in the world of AI now, I think we need to, as hard as it is for folks to come to grips with, we need to think about, and I know this isn't going to go down well with a lot of people in this audience, but we have to figure out ways of putting monetary value on it, if not explicitly. This whole system I'm talking about talks about credits. So, you know, and there's the exchange of credits. It's like carbon credits, basically. So, you know, I think we just want all of you to put in that kind of innovative thinking.
Thank you so much. And we are at time. Let's thank the panelists again. I also want to thank all of you for sticking it to the very last minute. Now there's a fabulous keynote coming up, so I hope you'll be able to stay for 1.5. I don't know how it's structured, but
one virtual and one real.
One real, and so it's a fabulous. Please attend if you can, and if not, safe travel.